Okay, recording is going.
Okay, still got a little bit longer, got about another minute. Oh, no, we don't. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to Discussion Design, Culturally Relevant OER for Online Learning. So hopefully you're in the right session. If not, we're going to keep on presenting. My name is Chris Luchs. I'm the Associate Dean of Career and Technical Education and Mathematics at CCCOnline. I'm also a doctoral student at Old Dominion, hence the lion in the fountain behind me. And with me today, I have Dr. Bridgitt Mitchell.
Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation today. I am Bridgitt Mitchell and I am the Department Chair of Early Childhood Education and Education for CCCOnline, and I look forward to having this conversation today.
And we also have Kay Novak.
Hi everybody, I'm Kay Novak. Someday I will be able to be introduced as Dr. Kay Novak, okay? Someday it will happen. I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Colorado, Denver.
All right, and so as we heard from the keynotes, it's all about the outcomes. And going back to the outcomes, so here's the quick outcomes for our session today, and that's define cultural competence, critical consciousness, and data justice. Discuss potential paths to incorporate one or all of these constructs into your curriculum, and create a strategy for incorporating culturally relevant, responsive, or sustaining learning object-based on your areas of instruction. So these are things for you to think about as we're discussing. And yes, this is a designed, as Kay mentioned in the chat. Feel free to put questions in the comments and chat. We'll be monitoring it. She also provides links to our slideshow, so you can feel free, if we're going a little faster, you can follow up on there, or if you don't quite catch a definition, you can grab it there as well. So first of all, just real quick over OER. So hopefully everyone by now has heard of the term OER, or Open Educational Resources. These are simply free to use materials that are available online. They can also be free, no cost. You can reuse them. You're not required necessarily to cite them. Some may have attribution, but basically the idea behind it is that there really is no licensing fee. There's not necessarily proprietary information. You're free to use, you're free to modify. You don't really need to, you do not need to ask permission to use these resources. So, where does our OER come from? Well, it comes from educators. It comes from educational institutions. It comes either directly or indirectly from the government, grants. It comes from nonprofits, either through grants as well or directly. They can create their own materials as well. Also, it comes from for-profit institutions putting out content as well. And in reality, OER content can come from anybody with an internet connection. Can go ahead and create OER and post it, and you can grab it and put it in the repository. And a lot of that, really comes down to what are the requirements of those that are maintaining these online repositories, where a lot of us go to grab our materials. So one of the things we'll have in this session a lot is these stop and thinks. And so this is where we sort of pause and we give everyone the opportunity to sort of think about something and go ahead and post in the chat. And so the first one here is, what strategies do you use to seek out OER content? So when you're looking for OER content, where do you go? Is there an individual that you go to? What is their role if that's an individual? Is there a location you got? Eric says, my librarian, Brittany. Anyone else? Where else do you go to seek out OER content? Big shout outs to the librarians. OER Commons from Jenny. Yeah, the CCC OER listserv, Canvas is Commons. Kay's asking if anyone is creating their own OER content. University Writing Centers. Good question, Kay. Kay's asking people, does anyone have their students creating OER?
Because you can. You can put them to work. They can create things that you can use next semester. Just get their permission.
That's fantastic, Melissa. That's awesome. Melissa she wrote a business law textbook with her undergraduate students and will be publicly available next month. Very cool. All right, so next up, we're gonna go ahead and head off to Bridgitt to talk about culture.
Hey everyone, I think as we are talking about OER and thinking about the course objects and elements that we include for our students, it's really important to think about kind of the why we are making those selections and who are we making those selections to, and how are the sources that we provide in our courses relevant to students. And particularly in my case, I had the wonderful opportunity of doing facilitating the entire overhaul of our early education department with CCCOnline, and the entire department is OER, and in finding the material, it caused our department to pause and think about these areas more critically. Next slide. And so as we look at culture, and I know many of you have been inundated with the definitions of what is culture. And in my discussion today, what I want you to do is think about culture in two ways. So think about culture in relation to yourselves, but then think about culture in relation to who your students are, as well as what are the institutional cultures that you're working within. And so culture is an integrated pattern of human behavior, and it's really important that we look at it as the way we think, how we communicate, our customs, beliefs, and most often when we speak of culture, we're really, most folks go to race and ethnicity. Yes, that is a significant part of culture, but we know that culture is much more broader than that term. And hopefully today we'll be able to go over some of those differences and facilitate your new thinking and how you look at culture in relation to your classes and how you facilitate the work that you do with students. Next slide. So for me and the work that I do, it's really important to understand the context of culture. And when we're developing material for students, it's important to know that we often do so from one perspective, our own lens. How do we see the world? And so I love Bronfenbrenner's model of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, as he really looks at the impact on other systems on the individual. That the nature-nurture dichotomy. So what were you born with? For example, I was born as an African-American woman, and so that could be some of those forward-facing characteristics that you that reveal themselves to you. And then what environments have I been exposed to? I grew up in a home with two parents in an urban community, with really aligned with faith. And so I want you to think about your own realities, your own context for culture, as you look at how we prepare the learning environment for our students. And why is this important to consider? It is important to consider because we teach who we are. That is our kind of go-to, right? I really know Bridgitt. So that's the lens that I'm going to operate from. And I really know Bridgitt's experiences, and I'm really familiar with those. And as professionals, as instructors or administrators, we often lean on our own lenses. So when we put our beautiful glasses on in the morning, they're tinted with us. And it's important to shift that lens a bit toward, who is Chris? Who is Kay? Who are my students? Who are the other people that are really integral into this equation of culture around me? And I think as we look at the landscape now and, you know, the interesting situation we find ourselves in, for me, I don't know what your thoughts have been, but I've really considered what is my context? What is my paradigm? And so, I know that many of you have also done that. So next slide. So in considering culture, you know, really considering the cultural aspects that you're born with, and I alluded to a little bit of that in the previous slide, it wasn't until I had diversity training when I really looked at all the nuances that really defined who I was as a person. You know, for example, again, I grew up in the African-American community, urban community, 2-family home. I'm the oldest of 5. All of those things are those cool aspects that come with you in every setting that you are working in. And so, and then what cultural aspect are you exposed to? And as a professional, for me, one of the first cultural aspects I was exposed to was really going to the university for the first time. And as I mentioned, I grew up in a predominantly African-American environment, and I went to the University of Kansas, which was did not reflect who I was and where I was from. So there was this cultural shift. So what cultural aspects were you exposed to on your journey as a professional, as an instructor, as an administrator, and how might they influence how and what you teach? And that is, I think, the overarching question, or the overarching context for this conversation. How do these factors influence how and what you teach? And so if you don't take anything else from this presentation, there's a lot of cool stuff, by the way, in this presentation. I really want you to jot that one down, because it is the most difficult one. On the surface, it seems very simple, but when you think more deeply, it's the most complex, I think, of the considerations. And as you do so, know that it impacts the selection of materials that you use for your course. For example, when we were developing our OER material and going over those objects and those materials that were curated from the library, the questions were, do these fit our students? Are they the right materials? Well, who is this for? What language is this? What country did this come from? What is the relevance of this material? And that is the kind of lens that I hope that you are walking away with as you make those critical decisions for your students. And then what is the perspective of the course? So when you're writing a course, is it just from your lens? Is it just from Bridgitt, who grew up as the oldest child in the urban community, and are all of my examples and is the entire course grounded in who I am? Or is it grounded in who the students are, and what are the social impacts going on within the community? So really think about what perspectives, and I think this is really critical when we look at assignments. Often we look at assignments as very stagnant. For example, in ECE, one might be to interview a parent. That sounds incredibly benign until you start thinking about what are the characteristics of the parent? What languages do the parents speak? What is the demographic of their community? And then the assignment reveals other elements that you might not have considered when assigning it to the student. And then lastly, the relevance to the student. Why does this matter for them? Is this just some gee whiz cool element that you've inserted in your course because you love it? Or is it really relevant to the students right now? And for CTE, we really are preparing the students for realistic work experience. And so we want our classes to reflect what the real workforce looks like today. And for, you know, CTE, that presents quite a few challenges. So what does that look like? And for me, working in ECE now, a huge impact is the COVID-19 and observations and practicums for student teaching. And so in that instance, we've really had to look at our courses to think about how can students meet competencies in this real world situation. So as we're talking about culture, you know, just transition away from that introspective lens, which is very important, toward really looking at what's important for your students. And so now our next stop and think. So just stop and think for a moment. How does who you are influence what experiences you provide to your students? And I'm going to repeat that because that is so powerful for me. How does who you are influence what experiences you provide to students? And then secondly, how does who you are influence what materials you provide for students? So think about that for a moment, and please join us in the chat as you explore these ideas for yourselves.
And Bridget, I'm going to jump in here, and
Please
here's
do.
why people are writing. And I have to thank a University of Colorado Denver class that I took on bilingual education and policy. And for me, that was it was a real eye opener. And the reason why is because I come from Eastern European immigrants, right? And my grandmother spoke like 4 different languages. And in the neighborhood, they spoke a lot of different languages. And it wasn't until I took that course that I was reminded, you know, it's not just bilingualism. There may be 3 languages. There may be 4 languages that you can't make the assumptions that it's just going to be English and Spanish because that's what maybe you've been hearing or where you lived for a while. And so for me, that taking that class really helped me think about my roots and helped me think about, you know, the neighborhood where, yeah, people spoke English, but you heard a bunch of other languages and it wasn't a big deal. Everybody knew some words from whatever, you know, whatever interaction you had to have, you knew the words from there. And that's something that I'm now thinking about when it comes to research, writing papers, and also designing.
And Kate, thank you for mentioning that. And it's really important as we explore the conversation with culture. We won't get it all at one time. I mean, I know that wasn't very academic, but we're not going to get it all the time. And we are going to learn from our students, learn from our team members, learn from our institutions, other elements of culture. And I think what's really important here is to acknowledge that, yes, there are cultural differences, and then also the awareness of cultural differences. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit later on about, you know, Banks's model, but then the openness to learn other, you know, ways of how people are, you know, doing things. And someone said that they, you know, really try to get to know their students. And that is sometimes really tough online. Right? How do we get to know our students, and what do we do with that information? And I struggle with that every semester. How do we integrate who our students are in online learning in a really effective way to honor their cultural experience and also support the capacity that they will have in our courses? And I love this, learning who I am as a learner. So I think from this conversation, it's just really, we will learn every day. I think when, you know, going back to my rosy glasses, I love my Bridgitt glasses. They're sparkly and cool and awesome. But how do I pick up another pair and see the world from a different perspective? And when I see that new perspective, how do I have the openness to embrace those differences in a meaningful way and be ready for the conversation of, you know, what if and how could and how might this look different for my for the demographic that I'm supporting? So thank you for your questions, and thank you for you know, going on this journey of culture. And I think it is kind of, it's one of those lifelong learning elements, and especially I think if you're in higher education, it is something that we need to put in our repertoire, that is it's so that we'll have some intentionality around the conversation in each setting that we're in. Okay, next slide. Okay, so becoming culturally competent, and this kind of lends itself a bit to the previous conversation. So I love becoming, it's a work in progress. So we're not going to, I don't wake up and I'm like, oh, I'm culturally competent. It would be nice. Because I'm still grappling with who I am. Remember the ecological model. As we learn about others, we also learn more deeply about ourselves. So this is a ever changing, cyclic kind of continuum that we'll go, that we'll embark on as we're learning more about culture. So next slide. So what is cultural competence? And I think that's almost like a trick question, right? I mean, there's not one right answer, but in short, it's the ability to interact effectively with different people from different cultures. And, you know, this topic, we could probably have 3 webinars, 2 courses. I mean, it can go on and on and on. And, but I think it lies in that awareness and to acknowledge that people are different around you, and then the appreciation for those differences, and not superficially, but in a meaningful way. And as we look at, you know, our courses in relation to OER, meaningful will be for me to select, you know, content that really does meet the needs of the students that I serve. Meaningful for me would be to really have a clear voice on the policy within my institution around supporting the needs of the students that I serve. So as we become culturally competent, just really look at also the impact and the applications, because I think that is more, you know, where it really does blossom, and just to know it's not just a stagnant term. So when folks walk up to me and say, I'm culturally competent, I have a question mark on my forehead. Well, how did you do that? That's really cool, because I'm in the process of cultural competence, meaning that I am in the process of learning the richness and the beautiful aspects of differing people around me, and how to incorporate and implement those in the work that I do in a meaningful way. Next slide. So why is cultural competence important to online learning? I think we've alluded a little bit to that, but it really supports the unique needs and interests of the student body. And I'm going to admit, remember in my cultural dialogue that I am an African-American woman. And I'm the oldest of 5 children. I grew up in a predominantly African-American community. None of that came to mind for me until we went through the redevelopment process. And I thought, hey, everyone has this kind of uniqueness about them. So I knew it superficially, but not in an application sense. So how do I support me in the classroom? So another little girl like me that's in my classroom, how do I support her? And then how do I support Chris? How do I support Kay? So when you have that composition of those 20 students, and I think most often this happens during our introductions in the online environment, when students students say, hey, I have 5 years experience of teaching. I'm a single mom. I grew up on the farm. You get some of those little indicators of what the needs might be for your students. But this is really important, as I think Chris and I were having a conversation. The demographics of our students are no longer the demographics of 20 years ago, when everyone graduated from high school and went straight to college and lived in the dorms. Some of our students are homeless. Some of our families, our students are food insecure. Those are elements that we need to consider. So what do your deadlines look like for your courses? What is your late policy? So in thinking about the unique needs and interests, it's beyond, race and ethnicity, but more, what are the cultures that your students are working in and living in? And then this is a way for us to optimize instruction. And for me, I don't know if, we have those courses, managing discussions, and we have the guidelines of, inserting announcements, optimizing instruction. This is when I have fun with my course, right? I can tweak it. I can find the things that my students really love, and I can follow their lead with information. And in my classes in education, one of the things that I do, we have the hot topics. What's going on? At several semesters ago, mastication, and many people don't know what that means, but parents pre-chewing their food and feeding it to their children. That was such a hot topic. Well, that's a cultural issue. And so it took over my classroom for the semester, and we had so much fun, and anyone looking at our class would not know what it meant, but we had created that culture. This is the thing that we're interested in. This is what's really important. And you can follow the lead and energize your classroom. And then it fosters a diverse workforce. And in early childhood education, that's real critical for our, and I'll use a lot of the examples from CTE, because we do train teachers, but our workforce is working with the diversity within our communities. And so what we do in our classroom really does matter around culture. We have to model and demonstrate that appreciation, as well as how to support diverse populations, as that's what our students will be doing. That is what their real world work will be. And then it improves the quality of life indicators for the community at large. If culturally competent institutions really are providing resources and support that are meaningful for the community. Again, as we talk about homeless populations, we talk about access to technology. Those are some of the big topics that we can have some influence on as we look at this online learning. So culture and learning are really closely tied together, and it's hard to sort them out because they're one and a part of one another. And I know that sounded really interesting, but they're interrelated. And I think as we, as teachers and administrators and instructional designers, consider the elements. And while I am in a, the social scientist, and so really looking at about people, what does this look like for math? What does it look like for science? But it still is relevant, regardless of our topic and our expertise. It's how do we meet the needs of our students? Next slide. And if you can't tell, I really love this stuff. I'm so just so the 5 elements of cultural competence for the individual. And I try to, for this part of the conversation, I really want you to look at you and then look at you in your institution. That's really important, because you're always going to have you, right? I mean, sounds pretty profound, but then you will have impacts on the institution. So for yourself, you acknowledge cultural differences. And we've talked about that, that each of us brings our own cultural soup to the party, right? And so we all have all of these experiences, our education, our background, and religion, all of those elements, and just acknowledge that each of us has our own unique configuration of culture, and that is okay. And sometimes we're just going to acknowledge that it's okay, and then understand your own culture. So when I'm working with Chris, or when I'm working with Kay, or when I'm working on my team, how does my culture influence that work? How do I show up? What can I contribute? And this is really important. And I think Chris and I were talking about it, because we're often, advocates for our own culture. Right. And so in that advocacy, what are, and when we're in these leadership opportunities, how does that manifest? By knowing really who you are and what your own culture is. Engage in self-assessment. And I love—
Actually, Bridget, we have a quick question from the chat. So Carol's asking, would students be more empowered with face-to-face meetings through Zoom or WebEx to allow them to ask questions and talk about their difficulties and just vent, as opposed to a current like asynchronous model where they wouldn't necessarily have that ability?
Yeah, I think that would certainly be the case. And I know some of the elements that we've tried, like UJA, like making ourselves, connecting any way that we can connect to the student, it really supports kind of that cultural sharing, if you will. Mm-hmm. I think when our students are comfortable in conversations, it really gets fun, right? I mean, many of us transition from face-to-face teaching mm-hmm. to online teaching, and we know the differences is making those connections. So certainly, any opportunity that you can get in front of your students is great. One of the activities that I do for my class, and I'm a perfectionist, so this was really tough for me, just so you'll smile when you hear the it was really tough because I'm perfect, right? But we were talking about working with children and getting it right and what our expectations were for children, and I participated in a craft class. And the craft class was very organized. They gave me 8 material. They gave me the list. You do steps 1 through 5. And I completed them. I was on my own program in my perfect way. And I looked up and my product did not look like that instructor's. I don't know where I was during instruction, and I don't know what happened, but I shared that with my students that semester, and my students, it just shifted the energy in my class. They're like, oh my goodness, Bridget is real. She can't, she has difficulty with instructions as well. And then they were even supporting me. I like your version better, Bridget. I love that comment. But I say that to say it was an opportunity for us to meet together as that human connection, that was a little bit beyond the instructor-student connection. And once that we were able to establish that, our class had a much more, a different feel, in the sense that students would even share their mistakes in their classrooms with the rest of the class. It was fabulous. So yes, the answer to that, the long answer is yes. That I think that really does support this kind of cultural exchange. And then I think I was on 3, engage in self-assessment. And for me, that really is self-awareness. And in early childhood, I have the opportunity to do this quite often, working with my students, but then also observing sites. Sometimes we think we have it together, and I have this culture thing, but there are opportunities or situations you'll come up against where you realize, wow, I still have more work here. I have more work. So always just checking in with yourself on where you are, and it's okay if you're not quite there. I have an example. I was observing the school, and for early childhood education, there's a lot of drooling and diaper changing that happens in that field. And for me, I have no aversion. I can change diapers all day, but for drooling was a big deal for me. And we had this little guy come in who had a serious situation. We had chronic drooling. Well, that was an opportunity for me to self-assess. Uh-oh, Bridget, where are you here? what is your frame? And so that just know that you'll have those little times when you are tested yourself in your own security and knowledge and assurance that you are culturally competent. Acquire knowledge and acquire cultural knowledge and skills, learn more about other people, and then view behavior within a cultural context. And that is really important as we look at our students online. And for my students, many of them are first-time college students. This is their very first job, and they're coming to it because they babysat their little brother. And so I start there with my students. That is their cultural context. So my initial conversations can't be so theory laden that I lose them in the conversation. So how do you balance that? Next slide. So the five cultural elements, the 5 elements of cultural competence institutionally, and these are a little bit more difficult because they're global. So the institution to value diversity, and what does that look like? And when, most institutions now, I should say all, have some kind of diversity statement that is aligned with their institution. And so for, as practicing professionals, as instructors, as administrators, ask yourself, are we really doing this? And how does this look in our institution? How does it feel? But the first step is to value diversity, the richness and beauty of having those differences on your team. Conduct a cultural self-assessment. How do people feel about culture within the institution? And there are many institutions that have done this. I've presented at several of the community colleges, and this is always a really tough one because we generally have that kind of anecdotal data from our qualitative data from our instructors, but how do our students feel about how we value diversity? What does that look like? And then manage the dynamics of differences. What supports, varying the supports that we have for the varying needs of our student population. Institutionalize cultural knowledge, and I think this really is, important for our leaders to really champion understanding culture within the work environment, and then adapt to diversity. What do our policies say? What do they say? And do our policies have bias embedded in them unintentionally? There's not bias intentionally, but is it unintentional? What do our structures look like? What are our values? And are we walking the talk? Are we saying we believe in this, but then our policies don't kind of quite jive with our value statements? How does that look? What specific services do we provide to students? For example, that homeless population, how well are we supporting that population? So those are some elements to think about institutionally. Next slide. So in thinking about this whole notion of culture, I know Kay and I have talked about Banks quite a bit, but Banks has created 5 dimensions of multicultural education and really looked at them as kind of a jumping point or a segue for institutions to really challenge how they're meeting some of the diverse needs of our students. And the first dimension is that cultural integration. And at almost every class, every institution, we can find elements of cultural integration. And those are the lowest hanging fruit in Banks' theory, dimensions of cultural education. Those are those elements that we can fit in. Examples of, hey, these, African-American people did this. Native American people had this experience. So really just integrating that on superficially. And then the knowledge of the construction progress is dimension 2. And it's helping students to understand how and why our materials are the way they are. What are those cultural differences? And some of the examples that we might use that are really easy to understand and have been talked about quite often: science, right? Who are the inventors? And why do we have this very cultural lens on who's inventing? And then what is our history? And from whose perspective? So that would be that knowledge construction, helping students sort out some of these ideals from their own lens. And then dimension 3, the equity pedagogy, is when teachers actually change the way they teach. It's how you teach to meet the unique needs of the students in your classes. And this is a higher level from my perspective, and Kay, please feel free to chime in, but it's one of the most difficult aspects of teaching, because in online learning, generally we have somewhat of a template of our process, a template of our assignments, a template of our discussions. And so how do you tailor these things to meet the unique need of our students? And then in the instructional design process, how are you intentionally making considerations for who our students are? And then prejudice reduction is is the dimension 4. And this here is when we help students to develop positive racial attitudes, that it is okay. And in my classes, this discussion in our intro to education class is generally around the standardized testing and standardized exams. We have a very rich conversation about those racial attitudes that may be prevalent. And then finally, an empowering school culture and social structure. And this is when to look at the entire school and its processes and what kind of behaviors are celebrated. For example, are all cheerleaders, blonde and blue-eyed? Are all of your star basketball players 6'5" and African American? What does it look like? Do you have a social narrative in the culture of your school? And so Banks' argument is that as we look at multicultural education, it is integral to look at these elements and how we are facilitating the needs of students and where we are institutionally in supporting the needs of the students as we move toward cultural competence. Next slide. And then finally, just the cultural competence framework, and this is really relevant to curriculum. And I think when we go back to Chris's first few slides of OER, why are we selecting materials? How are we selecting materials? I think that we, in the development process, we can look at our materials in different levels and what the context for these levels are. And the very first level is a contribution level, and those are, instances when we insert, Black history, Cinco de Mayo, and those kind of references in our courses. And so while those are really great, it's just barely touching the surface. We just, for students to really get an understanding. And I know in education, this is important because many schools are, their policies are designed around this contribution approach. So when you look at, if you have children, look at their school calendar, you can see it all over. How the different celebrations and all of those things, those are great and they do acknowledge culture, but we would hope that institutions would be able to move forward with that. And then the adaptive approach is really looking at where we can infuse in the curriculum, opportunities in the curriculum where we can show and demonstrate to our students that there are varying perspectives and contributions from other cultures. And generally we can see this in like our language and literacy class. The teacher may assign a certain books, and some are African American, some are from the Hispanic culture. So that is a step up from the contribution substitution approach where we're just celebrating holidays. And then transformative approach is a change in the structure of how we're working with students, and viewing issues from the student's perspective. And I've put myself a little note. I love current events and bringing them in. For example, I would talk to my students, what is the impact of the COVID-19 on the population of color? That would be the transformative approach, having them think from their lens about a real world situation. How many opportunities in your courses do you have, you know, those kind of elements, transformative, evidence of transformative approach in your courses. And then the last, and this is the most controversial, the most difficult to achieve, as well as that whole social action approach, is to help our students to work through these problems with their solutions for these world problems. And for example, a great topic right now would be, let's talk about what would your solution be for access to healthcare. That would be a great social action approach and a higher level thinking for our students as we start looking at this cultural competence framework. And that is all I have for you today. So I think we're going to go to our next stop and think.
Well, actually, one last thing I want to say is, as an administrator, I have to say is I really, really like Banks's levels of multicultural education. And the reason is that it gives faculty a really concrete example for each level, and it makes those linkages very, very easy, so everyone can see a very clear idea of what is meant when you start looking at each of these approaches. And so definitely, if you're looking at implementing something like this into your curriculum, this is a really good model to start with, to sort of start the conversation, sort of help sort of as a guide initially as you go through, and to get everyone up to speed, because it does have those clear markers and that clear distinction level as you move up the levels. And it really sort of helps you assess where you're currently at, and also helps you set a benchmark or an idea of where you want to go.
And like you, Chris,
this is a great starting point for instructional design. When you're having those beginning conversations of where we want the class to go, and for that subject matter expert, the instructional designer, for the entire team to think about this construct in a meaningful way as they are building the courses. So I agree with you, Chris. I really love that it's so clean and succinct. And it's not the be-all, end-all, but it's a great beginning for us to have a really rich conversation and a consideration for culture in our courses.
and this is Kay. I'm just jumping in to go, like, this is like admin proof. Okay, this is like if you're talking to a chair or an associate dean, you can go see these levels. Let's do benchmarks. We could even think about SMART goals. And you don't have to, and not every assignment has to be at the transformative level. Perhaps, you know, module 1 is additive. Maybe, you know, like module 8, you get to transformative. And here's the thing, then you can show the levels and you can go, okay, for my goals this year, it's, you know, 3.
You mean scaffolding? You mean introducing scaffolding?
Yes. And again, we're going to go on this again. This is not the end all be all. This will not end racism, sexism, misunderstanding. This is a start. If you need a start, and when you're looking at open educational resources, this is a really good way when you're looking at an assignment, or if you're looking at an article or something like that, you can easily go, it's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb. You can go, oh, well, that reading's just a contribution. Oh, but this assignment's transformative. Oh, I found something from Haymarket Books, and that's a social action approach, so that you can start classifying these so that you can work your curriculum the way you want it to be.
So stop and think. So what level are you and or your institution in Bank's cultural competence framework? And you may not know, but this is this is a great question to take back to your institutions and think about, and with your teams and with your instructors, think about where you are and talk about where you want to go. So I'll leave chat open for a few minutes and see what your thoughts are.
And I jump back to the model so that way it's easier for folks to reference.
Thank you.
Sure. So we have Anna saying contribution level.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. Probably a lot of my institution courses are contribution. Some are in the additive level as well. Melissa, I think it depends on the department. Yeah, and you're going to have variation. I agree with Melissa that it's hard to categorize across the entire institution. So there will be, I totally agree, there will be variation depending on individual instructors.
But I'm going to say this. Now, a lot of you said you're a librarian. What don't you think it would make a difference if before your librarian helped you search for OER, you had you could explain this in 5, maybe 10 minutes. You know, talking to your librarian, say, okay, we really want to make sure that, you know, these modules at least have contribution. We want additive for these modules. We're looking for transformative or social approach for these. If your librarian can categorize, and trust me, librarians love to categorize, okay? Give them a taxonomy any day. The thing about it is the kind of conversations and the kind of searches that can happen if you can talk to your librarian in this way will make a difference when you're looking for culturally relevant OER.
And I think that for this conversation, so, you know, that you may be like in between these. You may, so you might not quite be the social action, but some of your transformative opportunities are really leading you to that direction. So know that you have, that there's places to grow. I love that. I don't know, Carol is saying transformative to social action. Woohoo, I want to be in your class. I haven't quite gone to social action, and I'm very, you know, excited about that opportunity, and I'm not quite sure how to get there yet. So if you are there, wow. And then I think going to Kay's, you know, her admin proof, I think this is also very palatable for your instructors. So when you're working on your teams, you can describe this, and what, you know, the beautiful part is, go now, put your cultural lenses on. I wish we all had glasses, and then all share ideas out, because it's really important that this will be achieved through teams and not through individuals. So, and I'm excited to see what I'm saying. And then Christy, yes, I think our ECE courses are transformative. Awesome. Okay, thank you.
All right. So next up, we talk about access and data justice. So one of the big things we've all heard, and I'm sure those of us that are involved in OER have all talked about, is the importance of access and how open educational resources are about opening up access and giving more and more people access to education, and how we're helping students succeed, either by lowering the cost or ensuring that all content is in the course. So that way, whenever students log in, they don't have to wait around for financial aid disbursements to be able to purchase the text or make decisions of, do they have enough money to pay rent or buy the book or different things like that. So there's lots of different things that we're looking at as from an access standpoint. We talk about access. And there's lots of resources. So we have OER Commons. Some of you alluded to these earlier in the slides, earlier in the first stopping thing. Merlot.org, OpenStax.org, LOR.cccs.edu. That's for the Colorado Community College System. That's our LOR. CCCOER.org, OpenCourseLibrary.org, WikiEducator.org. So you're seeing a lot of these various resources that are out there. So I'm setting you guys up. Stop and think. What media format is your OER content in? How do your students access it? How has COVID changed things? So let's start with the first one. Go ahead and type in chat. So what is the majority of your OER content in that you're experiencing? Is it print? Is it, do you go to your library and get a hard copy of it? PDF, so Eric is saying PDF. Is there anything you need to have to access the OER content? If you're a student, PDF, same info on web link. So we're kind of hitting that. Some Flash applications. Well, hopefully they're not Flash anymore. Hopefully they're HTML5. From an accessibility standpoint, hopefully they're HTML5. But typically, a lot of our OER, we're requiring our students to have the internet. You know, they have to have access to it. They have to have a computer. They have to have it. And what are we finding out now with a lot of the how's COVID's changed things? What are you finding out? Azam is I apologize if I butchered your name. Is saying that we considered mailing materials. That's one of the things we've considered that as well. We've actually, University of Maryland, on a big call with a couple groups that were talking about community colleges in 4 years, talking about how they're handling COVID. They talked about one of the things the University of Maryland did is they emailed out to all their students a map of the campus parking lots, and they actually had their IT folks go out in the parking lot and they mapped out where they could actually still get Wi-Fi access in the parking lot. And so they actually marked out what parking stalls students could still park in their cars and still get access to the Wi-Fi on campus, so they could still access internet because students didn't have internet at home. So Anna said they did that as well. Students are parking outside of Starbucks. Students are still coming to their campuses and trying to access internet because they don't have internet at home. And so that's one of the challenges we have to think about is as we're doing a lot of these open resources, there's an assumption that our students have access to the internet. And we're seeing that through some of our friends in the K-12 sector, that they're not allowed to give online homework. They're not allowed to give online resources because of this issue of not having access. They're still giving out or dropping off, you know, print offs. They're still dropping off handouts. They're still dropping off, you know,
I think they call them worksheets.
Worksheets, yes, worksheets.
Because I've heard it said not in a good way.
Yeah, I know. Well, back in my day, it was mimeograph, you know.
And also from the comments, I'm hearing that from a lot of people about like computer sharing. Like one of our people who did a poster for ELK. She's at home with her daughter and her daughter's 3 kids. The 3 kids are all in school. She's supposed to work at home and her daughter is supposed to work at home. And guess what? It wasn't a big deal before that they only had like one PC for them to work on it. Now they have like this very strict schedule on who goes on what so that things can get done.
And I just want to say, this is Bridget, and I know I really talked about culture, but I see that someone posted that they are working with their students through COVID IED, and it's not the technology aspect. So really think about culture again. Well, this is a really interesting time, and our students need really dynamic, tailored supports to help them get through this. And not only our students, but many times our instructors as well. So this may look a little bit different. And I just wanted to bring that up so we can, kind of tie the thread a bit of how all of this is interrelated. So.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that caused us to. One of the things we did in the recap this morning when Kay and I did the Elk Morning Show. For those of you that attended, we put out the link to the chat from the trauma presentation yesterday, and we included some links in that chat from trauma-informed instruction. So that's something else we might want to look up as well. Is as instructors is look at go back to some of those resources. A lot of it is geared towards K-12, but it's something we can still use. There's a lot of concepts we can still use in higher education about how to work with adults who are dealing with trauma, and our students, our young adults who are dealing with trauma. This is we have lots of folks who are, who, as I said, have been affected with losing family members. And so those are things that we're seeing a lot of grief. We're seeing a lot of trauma, lost jobs, a lot of stress coming about because of this. And so that's some different things to look for as well. And Kay just posted that link in the chat. So that has a couple different great resources there from Teaching Tolerance and some other resources there that talks about trauma-informed teaching.
And if you didn't come to it yesterday, you just might want to read the chat, just because we ended up with like 120 people in it, just basically sharing what's going on.
Yeah, and also family members. Yeah, Carol. And so a lot of us hit on these already. Internet speed can be an issue. Connection quality, access to computers. You may be one of everyone in your family has to schedule time to have access to the computer. There may only be one computer in the family, and maybe the parents or the parent has to have access to the computer for work reasons, and so the children do not have access to it until non-work hours or during lunch hour. May not have webcams. There may not be a private area. May not be a private study area. It's a lot of parents with children are finding out there's no separate study area or private study area anymore in the house because everything becomes the classroom. Also from the class side, everyone Zoom bombing and dealing with Zoom, vetting technologies, rapid deployment of new technologies, where folks, where the colleges and educational institutions didn't have time to test technology because they didn't have enough lead time to make sure everything worked perfectly and to train up everybody perfectly to get everyone up to speed on the technology, so everyone's learning. And so you have all these issues that are there. And I put here as a little thing down at the bottom, who has time to read all those end user licensing agreements in terms of service? So that's the other question that's going on is what is inside all of those contracts that are out there. So there's lots of things, especially in a world of data capture, or as we listed in some previous in our keynote on at noon, age is the age of surveillance capitalism, where there's lots of companies that are making money off of collecting data and selling data. So those are things that we all have to be cognizant of as we're grabbing things and doing things. So this brings us to this wonderfully delicious question that we've talked about a couple times, is should the internet be a public good?
I have lots of opinions on this. you might have seen them.
Do you really have lots of opinions, or you just have an opinion that you feel very strongly about?
I have an opinion with several parts to it. Okay, and if you were on different sessions with me over the last 3 days, you would have seen those regularly in chat.
So let folks think about that. So should the internet be a public good? And the answer so far, and I will tell you, currently it is not a public good. What exactly do I mean by public good? And what I mean by that is, should it be run like a public utility, like power companies, like your electric or your water, or public transportation, where it is a public service that everyone has access to? We got yeses, we got lowercase yeses, we've got title case yeses, we've got big uppercase yeses. We've got a lot of yeses. Education and healthcare, lots of yeses. We got yes and no. It would still have inequities, yes. Those who could pay should have better services, so more speed, channels, etc. So it's almost kind of like the healthcare proposal, where there should be a baseline internet connectivity for everybody, and if you could afford it, then you could have a higher end version. I think, Kay, you're muted. I can see you're talking, but I can't hear you.
Okay, I was going to say, I just tossed in, we do have OER resources you can use that have opinions on this. But it doesn't have to be your opinion. You could show it to your students as something like, well, this is someone else's opinion, debate, or something like that. And Carol, yeah, that's a part that we didn't even bring up. We didn't even bring up monitoring and what is appropriate and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
And Anna, yeah, different devices need, different bandwidth. I mean, I will tell you, even for doing this conference, and eLearning Consortium of Colorado we just filed for our 501(c). Yeah, we debated about, okay, we'll get a Zoom account. How much access are we going to have for a Zoom account? Who's going to have access to it? What are we going to do about Zoom bombing? All that kind of stuff.
And I think this is, Bridgitt, I think right now, especially with the situation we are in the world, with all of the disparity across health, and so we know that, disparity is a big issue, but the access, populations need access to information. And, when we start looking at it, many of the folks for COVID-19 or people of color, the first question was, what access to information do they have during this, as well as access to healthcare? So yeah, these are very big questions, and I think institutionally they need to be considered. So.
And that's the thing for OER, is OER so digital that you have to have access.
And so this is the slide you've seen probably in a couple of different presentations Kay's been involved in, and so you see where Kay stands. And yes, I agree. I think the internet should be available for all. I think that there are lots of arguments. If you want the arguments for why it shouldn't be a public good, just go to the FTC website. There's lots of they basically tell you why the FTC believes it should stay the way it should stay private good, which is the way it currently is. The standard, well, it would be tragedy of the commons. If it was public, it would be bogged down because there'd be no incentive for innovation or making it faster or higher speeds, etc. Whereas if it was and that's why you should have higher rates of speed and things like that. If you are looking for argument to have why it should be a public good, then there's this statement here. The United Nations Human Rights Council declared access to the internet should be a basic human right, integral to allowing individuals to exercise their right to freedom of opinion and expression. So this is the United Nations acknowledging that because we become such a technology plugged in world, that internet has almost become almost a universal right, because this is how everyone is expressing their freedoms. This is how everyone's expressing their freedom of opinion and expression. So something that here in the U.S. We definitely like our First Amendment rights. So that is something to think about if you're looking for additional support for those arguments for public good, as internet as a public good. But now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we'll start going into one of our key constructs, data justice. So let's talk about COVID-19. It's very, very topical right now. It's also highlighting something else that's going on. Besides individuals' access to technology, individuals' access to the internet. So I don't know if folks are starting to see this themselves in the news, on their news streams or not. You're starting to see headlines, NPR, racial disparities. You're starting to see U.S. government has urged to release race ethnicity data on COVID-19 cases. Here in Colorado, state releases initial race and ethnicity data on COVID-19 cases. Some of you may have heard of another group out there called Data for Black Lives. And I'll put that in the chat group. And so this is a group that rolls around a construct that we were talking about earlier called data justice. And so we'll define that shortly. But really, this is something that we're coming out. And Bridgitt's sort of been talking a little bit about it earlier. But these are some of the statistics that are coming out here in Colorado. And so this is what we're starting to see. And this is one of the things that having access to data is important. So we'll look at white non-Hispanics, 67.8% of the population, only 59% of the COVID cases, 69.1% of the COVID-related deaths. Hispanic individuals who identified as Hispanic ethnicities, 21.7% of the population. They account for 28.1% of the COVID cases and 17.7% of the COVID-related deaths. Individuals that identify as Black or African American non-Hispanic ethnicities only account for 3.9% of the population in Colorado. However, they account for 7% of the COVID cases in Colorado. They also account for 6.8% of the COVID-19 deaths in Colorado. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, 0.1% of Colorado population. However, they're 0.6% of the COVID-19 related cases and 1.6% of the deaths. Yes, Kay.
And Chris, I was going to say that the real tie-in why you're bringing up this data justice, some of the tie-ins are, if you are getting OER material, how are people being represented in the data that you're getting? The numbers that you're getting, where are you getting your information from? Is it reflecting what we're actually seeing here? Or, you know, sometimes OER is very whitewashed. And even if the narratives are, you know, are more diverse, sometimes the numbers do not respect reality or diversity.
And if you want to look at that data yourself, I just put that link in the chat. It's a mix of information, Carol. A lot of it comes down to not necessarily having resources, not necessarily having the resources to be as well informed. Other pieces is not necessarily having the necessary ability to work remotely, not having jobs that allow them to work remotely, not having access to good health care, not having overall, also there's also the issue of having underlying health issues additional prior to COVID. So there's a lot of different things that are going on. You look at Flint, Michigan, there still have lots of folks in Michigan who don't have access to water still. You can think about that. In the middle of COVID, you live in a house that has no water, that the water is still not turned on. So there's lots of different things, but here in Colorado, there's lots of different things, different reasons for it. A lot of it is lack of information. A lot of it is misunderstanding, misinformation, not knowing where to go for information. There's also
Chris, I'm just jumping in. Chris,
No.
Chris, there's a lot of things that when you come to this, I would say do a Google search, look at the ACLU reporting on it. Look at, go ahead and Google search and do things like that. Reverend Al Sharpton has done some wonderful material on this. There's underlying inequities when it comes to access, access to healthcare, socioeconomic status that have not been addressed. You can hear a lot of this on the news, and I know there have been different doctors who are petitioning the CDC to keep accurate records of this. And there's a lot of states that when it comes to the deaths and people who contract COVID, they are not reporting on race or ethnicity. And sorry, I burst in as someone who does critical education. Chris is very much an accounting person, so we talk about these things differently.
Yes, we do. And so really, this is what we're getting at, is data justice. And data justice really ties to the way the fairness and the way people are made visible, represented, and treated as well as their production of digital data. And so this is some of the things that we're looking at here. So the COVID data that we're seeing here, while this is medical data, but the same thing applies whenever you start looking at digital data. And really the pillars of data justice are these three things: visibility or invisibility, disengagement with technology or engagement with technology, and anti-discrimination. And this is from Taylor 2017. So when you're thinking about your OER resources, when you're thinking about picking these different resources and going through this, this should also be something that you're thinking about when you're reading your materials, when you're looking at the statistics or you're looking at the data that you're creating in your course, your content that you're creating. Look at your fairness. How are you representing individuals? How are you going ahead and making sure that you're providing a fair representation that's out there? And again, and whenever everyone hears the word data, you go ahead and everyone thinks of what? You guys all think of Star Trek, right? So, and this is a wonderful little riff off of the Cambridge Analytica trial that was going on. And this is a riff off of Mark Zuckerberg, of course, Mr. Data Accumulator, data from Star Trek, and talking about the sale of user data from what's going on. And so this is one of the big things that came out of when you're looking at using technology, or when you're grabbing and you're pulling information in, how are individuals going ahead and being presented and what's being used with their data. So when it looks at visibility or invisibility, it looks at really the topics here are about privacy and representation. So how are individuals and groups represented by their data? And the same thing applies to your OER. So when you look at your class and you look at your content, how are you representing groups based on the information, the data that you're providing your students? Individual and group privacy is another piece to look at that. So when you're looking at evaluating new technologies or adding things, you do want to read those end user licensing agreements. You do want to read those terms of service. And you do want to see how these companies might be using your student data. The other question out there is that's going to fall under this visibility or invisibility is data a public good? So should data be treated like public transportation? Should everyone have access to the data? Should only certain people have access to the data? Should only people who can pay for the data have access to the data? One of the things you'll see is that you might want to use is a lot of cities have open data portals where you can actually take your students out and you can actually get them access to the city data, and they can go ahead and pull that through. Here in Colorado, Boulder has an open city open data portal. Denver also has open data as well. And so there's a couple cities around. So just check and see if your city has an open data portal that the city will provide data for that your students can access, or you can access as an instructor, that you can go ahead and look at. Another thing to think about when it comes to visibility and invisibility is our next topic here is, does anyone here recognize any of these symbols? So Melissa says yes, Native American women. Kay's giving everybody a hint by giving everyone a hashtag. So for a lot of individuals, these symbols or this hashtag is invisible. It's not something we think about on a daily basis or something that we come across. MMIW stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This was a study that came out in 2018 from the Urban Indian Health Institute. And this really raised an awareness about something that was invisible for a lot of folks. And this really was something that no one was aware of, except for those working with Native women and those working with indigenous groups. And these are just some of the statistics that came out of this study. That 4 out of 5 of our Native women are affected by violence. Homicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among 10 to 24 years of age, and the 5th leading cause of death for American Indian and Alaska Native women between ages 25 and 34 years of age. So these are things that is data that's out there that is hidden, that we didn't really see a lot. And the other thing about it is, particularly for this data, and what they found was this data actually was hidden. It was missing because they found that indigenous women, a lot of indigenous women weren't reported missing. They weren't reported to the authorities. They weren't reported to the tribal leaders. They just didn't keep track of the data. They didn't file reports. They didn't want to file the reports. And so it took an entire a very large group of committed individuals doing a very long process to find out all of this data, to pull this out. It is a very heartbreaking report. It's a very important report. That definitely is something that we should all be aware of. And so these are some things that are out there that when we're looking at our data justice and we're looking at how can we introduce our students to give students access to understand what's going on and to make sure that we are allowing folks to be visible or allowing people to choose to be invisible when it comes to both the way they're represented both in our classes and in society as a whole. The next pillar is disengagement. So whether they choose to engage with digital technology or disengage with technology, it focuses on their freedom to choose to use technology. So attitudes towards personal data and data collection. Do we give students an opt-out option? Really, for us, it's called enrollment, the offer of enrollment or the offer of admission for higher ed. If they choose to enroll, then they allow us to collect data on them. But also that's something to think about. Again, it goes back to those terms of service and those end user licensing agreements you want to be aware of. If you are the one making the decision about what software or what services that your students are signing up for, you should be reading these things and being aware of what data is being collected for your students and how that's going on, and making sure that you're aware of what the FERPA guidelines are when it comes to this. The other thing about it is opt-out awareness or options. So those are some things that you think of. If you're using a service like Turnitin or another plagiarism detection service, that's the thing, is you may allow folks to opt in, it may allow folks to opt out. Those are things that you have to decide on as an individual. Anti-discrimination. So this is a pillar of data justice as well. So these are things to think about. Focus on the power to identify and challenge biases in data and freedom not to be discriminated against. So when you're looking at your own resources, are you making sure that you're not picking resources that are being discriminatory? Are you making corrections in those? Because like I said, with OER data, we're just grabbing data that's out, we're grabbing the OER content that's out there. It's our job as educators to evaluate that content and make those changes if we're finding out there are biases present. And if those biases are not, they're not benign, then those are some things to look at. And some themes to think about with anti-discrimination is, and if you want to make sure that you're making it easier for students to fight discrimination, these are things you can do. Basically, make it easier for them to challenge and correct errors in their data. Make it easier, watch out for errors caused by linking and merging data sets, because it just multiplies. Those errors just multiply as more and more data sets get merged. The other thing to look at is Zwitter 2014 shows that as group interactions and decisions actually become more transparent when you have more and more data. So as we get larger and larger data sets, the actual motivations and the actual decision-making process of groups becomes more transparent. The other thing you have to watch out for is if you're doing a lot of data cleaning and a lot of data filtering, making sure you double check why you're making those cleaning decisions and those filtering decisions, because any inherent bias that's in there actually can be multiplied as that data is then filtered into the stream and then multiplied across multiple data sets. And again, I'm very data driven, so I apologize if this is
I was gonna say, data might not be sexy to you. I'm speaking for other people.
Okay.
It might not be, but think about the numbers that you're bringing in, thinking about what they represent, thinking about who they're leaving out. We're saying that these are all strategies when it comes for you choosing OER, and just because they're numbers, just because they're data, just because they're a data set, don't just, like we've said the whole time, don't just hand it off to somebody. Really think about this as you're looking at what kind of strategy you're going to have for evaluating OER.
Mm-hmm. And exactly, definitely be aware of data-driven discrimination. It happens. There's a whole industry called redlining in lending that came about because of data-driven discrimination, and that's one of the key topics in this anti-discrimination literature is how do you fight against data-driven discrimination. And so these are things that becomes apparent, especially as we start relying more and more on data. We have to start challenging those assertions. So remember, algorithms of oppression that was brought up and things like that. If there's any biases, we have to start taking that critical eye and looking at these processes and how that data was gathered, who was left out of the data collection, who made up we did a poll. If we grab a sample size, well, who made up that sample? Who was left out of that sample? Is it a weighted sample? Is it a representative sample? Those are things that you have to think about when we're looking at this data that's there. And obviously, I am really happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk more about data, but I will go ahead and hand it off to Kay, and she will talk about critical consciousness. So,
okay, I got 3 minutes. Okay.
Oh, you got way more than that. It's fine.
No, we said this would be 90 minutes, remember? We
can go more than 90 minutes. We have till 3 o'clock, actually.
I am just going, move to the next one. Okay, critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is recognizing, decoding, and analyzing systems of inequity and inequality. This comes out of critical race theory. So critical consciousness is recognizing what the system is, who benefits from the system, and what the injustices are. And we're saying, and when we went through those Banks's level, this is getting into the transformative and the social action. That's what critical consciousness is. So go ahead, next slide, please. Okay, this is a great example from someone who's does wonderful work when it comes to this. He has an essay called Taco Tuesday, okay? And it explains when he was in grade school about how they did a taco night, and that was their multiculturalism, and critical consciousness wasn't even mentioned. The reason I'm bringing this up is when you're looking for resources, be wary. Anytime you see food, be wary. Okay, read it critically. See what it's addressing. See that it's not just saying something like, okay, you know, you have a Polish background, we're going to have pierogi day. Okay, you want to get beyond that. So we just pulled this up because this was a lens that Chris, Bridgitt, and I really looked at when we were looking at material. That material we were getting, that it is not in the category of Taco Tuesday or Taco Night. Okay, next slide. An example of something like this that just recently happened was the book American Dirt. American Dirt was a story of immigrants coming up through the southern American border, and it was not written by someone who had this kind of background. It was written by a white person. It was written by somebody who did not have the credibility nor the critical consciousness to cover a lot of it. And there was a big protest about this. And actually the book got pulled from a lot of places. So when you're looking at material, look for authenticity. Look for if the people actually have the critical consciousness to, say, be doing the research, writing the books, or even, you know, if you're making slides, have the authenticity to be able to do this. Continue, please. Okay, so instead of Taco Tuesday, the person who wrote that essay, go over to his material in EdChange. Now, if you look for him on Twitter, he's really good. And I was just looking at him on Twitter yesterday, and he's putting out a couple tweets like, well, it's really nice for white people to celebrate multiculturalism, but that doesn't dismantle anything. That doesn't help with racism, and it doesn't help with critical consciousness. If all we're doing is having a celebration of a culture, and we're not bringing the critical consciousness into it, and not looking at having our curriculum be transformative, or bring to or come over to social action. Next, please. Okay, this is an example that happens continually. Every year during Black History Month, you will see this. You will see someone who attempts something like this and gets it horribly, horribly wrong. And that's why it's not enough to just take the material and go, well, someone else has approved this. You have to look at it. You have to get your colleagues to look at it, and you have to have this critical consciousness view of it. And as far as Kyla, does every author have to have a personal experience to write a book of fiction? Aha, Kyla, lots of people have said that. Okay, that's a question that you, as an educator, have to ask yourself, and it's going to vary depending on what you're teaching. Now, I will tell you, as a woman, I would prefer to have a woman write about a woman's experience than have a man try to explain it to me. That is my personal preference. I think that is something that you have to look at critically, and I wouldn't answer it in the abstract like this. The example that I gave was very specific about a publishing company that made a decision to promote this as, and they were actually calling it as the next great Grapes of Wrath, and decided to have a white author write that book rather than look at all the wonderful Latinx authors and contract with them, and also and also bring more Latinx writers and Latinx books in. So that kind of question, very nice philosophical, I think it's a very nice philosophical question that you can have students debate. But for me, I would have to go to exactly what is happening. So in general, does every author have to have a personal experience to write a book of fiction? I read sci-fi. I'd say no. But if it was something that I was looking at bringing in that was culturally relevant for students, I would look for authenticity. And that's my opinion as an educator. Okay, continue. Okay, some of the places that you can go for material: Open Culture, Open Syllabus Project, the Edge change from Paul Gorski. Chris gave you some places that you can go for data. The Southern Poverty Law Center is great, and Teaching Tolerance. Okay, again, I'm saying don't accept something because you've been told that some expert approved it. Read it, look for the culturally relevant, the culturally responsive according to your students, as Bridgitt discussed in the beginning, and also the culturally sustaining. And I would go, and if you want an example of culturally sustaining, the example I would give you with languages. Now, Chris comes out of a field that's called business. And business, often in business courses, they say a second language is wonderful because it's good for businesses and you'll be able to work globally. And that is a very business viewpoint of it. From a culturally sustaining viewpoint, for me as a critical educator, it would be the language as a right, the right not to lose whatever your first language was. And I would be looking more for material that put forward things as language as a right, rather than an essay that says it's wonderful that you're bilingual because you'll get a really good job. In this context, how does one determine you have to look it up. You have to, hi Tina, you will have to put in the work. I mean, librarians can help you, your colleagues can help you, but you're going to have to put in the work. And my appeal is going to you as an educator. I know from an administrative viewpoint, it might be that those are lots of hours that you're going to have to spend, and perhaps you can't do it according to your budget. But as an educator and a critical educator, I have to say you're going to have to put in the work. Okay, keep going, Chris.
Well, one thing I was just going to say is sometimes the author will be anonymous, and so you can't answer that piece, but you can also read from it and also take it from a perspective, and look from a perspective and what their writing style is from. Are they taking a neoliberal or a business aspect, a pro-business aspect, and then are you balancing that with a balancing article that comes from a opposing perspective, so that way students are getting both sides and equal perspectives that are out there.
Okay, so for critical studies in education, we're saying when you're looking at OER and you want to make sure that it's culturally relevant, and this is your decision, culturally relevant, culturally responsive, and culturally sustaining, you will be asking those questions. When you read the article, who's benefiting, who is not, what can be done about inequalities, how can, as Chris said, how can you balance things? Go ahead, next slide. Because we're ending soon. And also looking for our multiple sources of identity represented. Our race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, country of origin, disability, who is or what is obscured or not in focus. These are things to look at when you're looking at OER. Next slide, Chris. Okay, and we put this as a resource. Kimberly Crenshaw, you can go onto TED and you can go ahead and watch her video, and she does a really good job at explaining it. She is a legal scholar. She does critical race theory, and actually she was the first lawyer who actually started with the term intersectionality. And what happened was a lawsuit, and this was, I believe, the Ford Motor Company. And what she proved in court was that it was not that women were being discriminated against because they looked at the salaries and they weren't, and it wasn't that Black men were being discriminated against in salary. It was the intersection of being Black and a woman that there were huge disparities when it came to salaries and promotions. And we're putting this up here, the term intersectionality, and you can go ahead and read that. But the idea is that even if you try to do like the intersection of two things, not one label is ever going to explain all the different variations that can be present in a person's experience. So these are some of the terms that we want to put up here for you to have you think about when you're looking at open educational resources. And we're not saying any of this is easy. It's hard, okay? It's hard, but it's worth it. And okay, and Kathy's going, look, are there specific things I should look at besides being scientifically competent? And we're gonna have to move quick, Chris, but this is what we want you to think about. So Chris, you're gonna have to do the slides quick. We want you to think about what kind of test you need for yourself and some of the other terms, and we went and put the slides in there so you can come back and look at them. Now, here's a couple of good ones that honoring Indigenous writers. People went and did Wikipedia. Colorblind racism. If race is never mentioned, that's an indicator, okay? Because racism is everywhere. If everything that you have, it's never mentioned, then you're probably looking at things that show colorblind, that fall into colorblind racism, okay? Or fall into sexism. So Chris, if you'll go forward. Okay, keep going forward just because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, what we're gonna skip to is possible equity tests. We want you to come up with that list. And Kathy, I think it's a great question. You're saying, what else should I be looking for? We're gonna give you some ideas of what else you should be looking for. Brittany, here's what I will tell you. When it comes to looking at OER specifically, I want you to come up with your list. I want you to come up with whoever your content experts are who know that field and area so that you can come up with what it should be. Now, the Bechtel-Wallace test, here's an example. A lot of people know this one already. Here's the test. The test for the Bechtel is, are there two women, whether they're in a book, whether they're in a comic, or whether they're in a movie? Do the two women talk about anything other than guys? This test is known, and you'll see this on the internet a lot. So how are women being represented? I will tell you, I love action movies. I love martial arts movies. Guess what? Oftentimes, the woman is the victim who gets killed off, or is the love interest, and that's all she is. So in your field or area, you know, how are women represented? How are people of color represented? Go ahead, click on the next one, Chris. Okay, this is a cool one. This is the Finkbeiner science test, and this is for science journalism. And Kathy, I'm thinking, I am thinking that we can pull some of this for you, okay? Now, the articles that you might be pulling, or the examples that you're having, especially if you're trying to show women's contributions, this is a Finkbeiner science test. Here's a checklist when it comes to science journalism and science journalism reporting on women. In the article, does it mention that she is a woman? It's like, why do you have to mention she's a woman? Okay. Does it mention what her husband's job is? Why is it important to know her husband is also a scientist or a banker or a millionaire or whatever it is? Her child care arrangements. No offense, Bridgitt, I know you're ECE, but why, you know, if this was an article about a man, if a man was being reported on, would the science journalist mention his child care arrangements? There's usually the quote about, was taken aback by the competitiveness of the field, that she's a role model for other women, or how she's the first woman too. I would say things like, Kathy, when you're looking at, first of all, images. Images are so important, okay? Are only white people represented in your geology? Are only European scientists mentioned? I would also say, is anybody cited from the global south? I mean, really, no one from South Africa ever did anything in geology. I have no idea, it's not my content area, but these are things to include more. Now, we'll show you some more tests. Okay, the Makimori, like I told you, I love action movies, okay? If you ever saw, or anyone from your family ever saw the movie Pacific Rim, it's the Makimori test. The female character, does a female character have a narrative that's not supporting a man's story? If you're pulling literature, is this what's happening? Okay, now the next thing, you could definitely sub in people of color. You can sub in heteronormative. Is everyone who is being represented in this, are they all heteronormative? What do the families look like? Is every family a male, a father, a mother, and children? Yes. Yes, so an arc that's not supporting a man's story. What is being represented in the open educational resources that you're seeing? So go on to the next one. And these were a bunch of tests. Now, this is a DuVernay test. And Bridgitt, I'm gonna quote you when you saw this test on the or you can say it. Can I quote you? Is it okay if I quote you?
Yes, you can quote me.
Okay. So when we're going over these slides, Bridgitt goes, I don't need that. I know this already. And the thing of it is, sorry, I'm apologizing because my white racial epiphany, that I need a checklist like this, but it is a checklist. It is something that, when you come to colorblind racism, is something that I don't normally think of. And you as the educator are going to have to check yourself. I get checked all the time. I do things wrong all the time. I did not grow up where, I did not grow up, and I'm not making an excuse. I'm in fact apologizing. I did not grow up someplace where I had to constantly think about race, that it was constantly on my mind. So for me as an educator, when I'm looking at material, these are things I have to look at. Okay? Am I bringing a video in where there are people of color? And Carol, don't even get me on teaching. I can give you a whole economic reason. I can give you a whole economic thesis about women in teaching. but thank you for putting that there. But here, you can substitute characters of color. You can substitute in gender. You can substitute in sexual preferences, I'd like you to start thinking about what kind of test you need for your open educational resources. Are you going to substitute something like this? This one is, do the people of color have names? How much dialogue? Are they not romantically involved with each other? Is their role just comforting and supporting the main character? And is one of them not a magic stock character who like solves everything? So these are questions that you can start thinking about your field. And when you're looking at open educational resources, you can start designing this for yourself. And people are going to have different ones depending on their field. Like Chris's accounting one, I have no clue. Well, I absolutely do know. You heard the whole data justice thing. His would be about data set, data set, data set. Okay. For me in education, it is really looking at loads of this. Okay. So go to the next one. And this is one for me as a grad student, because I think this is called the Gray test. Hashtag Gray test. It's named after Kashana Gray. She is a professor at Penn State University in education. This is for us, those of us who are going in doctoral programs, but perhaps you would like to, perhaps this is something you would like to put for your students also. When you're writing a paper, you have to cite the scholarship of at least 2 women and 2 non-white authors, and you have to cite them meaningfully. Okay, and this is, I'm in a graduate association. We are really discussing this. We are discussing if we're going to write a paper, if we're going to go for a publication, we're going to look at this and look for this. And these are ways that if you are looking at open education resources, that you can go ahead and you can think about how to bring this in. I mean, what we've presenting here, if you're on an open education resource committee that's going to be going and looking for things, or a course development, why not make this into a discussion? Why not make this into a brainstorming session that says, okay, let's look at our reading material. Who's left out? Who's missing? Who should we be bringing in? Let's look at those images. Again, who's left out? Who's missing? Who can we bring in? Is everything Eurocentric? If we're looking at videos, who's being represented in those videos? Is everyone beautiful and rich, or is that kind of lifestyle? Can we bring in people who look like our students, who have our students' values? Can we bring in even our students' languages? Okay, so these are the things we want you to consider. Now, go ahead and click this, Chris.
And hey, while you're doing that, I just want to say something. I know, so for this information can cause you to like really do, self-reflection and, even kick yourself. And I didn't know, as we're exploring culture, I think I alluded to it before, we're trying to get forward momentum. As we know more, we do more, and we have better opportunities. And the wonderful thing about this work is that it is collaborative. We do work together. And so I just want to put that out there as I'm looking at the comments in the thread. I mean, this is heavy, right? Because we really do care about the work that we're doing, but no, we're doing it together, and we'll be learning together as well.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out for, you might have heard the book that came out like a year or 2 ago called White Fragility. Yes. You're gonna make mistakes. Okay, fellow white people, you're gonna mess up, you're gonna get it wrong. You can get past that, and you can enrich what you're giving your students so much. Okay? You can't.
And that's
So-
and that's one of the things is we've given you a lot of things to think about. There's a lot of content in these slides. We've thrown a lot at you. I know that there is some comments about asking for specific tests for just OER. I will respond to that right now. Since OER is just another form of content, all of these tests can apply to any type of content, not just OER. We can apply for just, even when you're looking at publisher content as well. So the thing is that, like I said, one of the outcomes here was for you as an individual. We were giving you the tools to create your own test, your own strategy of how you want to approach using this information, as well as going out and finding additional information of what will work for your institution. It depends on what your goals are. So like we said, what we used whenever we developed, whenever we were working on our project, we looked at Banks's model. We were looking at these levels, and we wanted to hit certain levels on the Banks model, and that was sort of what we used as our guiding post. And then we aligned with this model to go ahead and do that. And we picked and we selected our critiques of the content and how we evaluated our OER content based on how we wanted to get to the transformative approach with our OER courses. And it took a lot of time. It took a lot of discussions. We had wonderful discussions about where we wanted to go, about what content we wanted to show, everything from what images we wanted to have in the course, how the tone of the writing, how we want, what sort of perspectives did we want to make sure we provided, what type of alternatives did we want to provide students, what deliverables did we want to allow the students to have access to. These are all different things that come into these pieces. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for listening, and thank you all for your questions and participation. And we'll all release you to head on out over to the last keynote of the session.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much.